Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Daniel Levy. I'm moderating this session on behalf of Jewish Currents. I'm not part of Jewish Currents, but I want to thank the wonderful people at Jewish Currents, Ariel and Jacob and everyone for putting this together. I want to thank those who've joined us to be part of that conversation, those who are going to be speaking and presenting: Rachel Shabby, Emily Hilton, and Josh Schleifer. And you started it, Josh. So the piece that you wrote in Jewish Currents, The Tragedy of Jeremy Corbyn, which I understand has actually got an awful lot of views and eyeballs, and has contributed to a conversation which those of us who live on this side of the pond will be all too painfully familiar with. But we're going to talk about this issue. We're going to talk about what it means, how it played out, what could be the significance both in the UK and in the US and elsewhere going forward. And I'm sure it will kick off a whole range of issues that come to the fore. I do want to give a shout out to a fabulous piece that you've got up at Jewish Currents right now that is based on a conversation between some friends of mine: the Palestinian cause at a moment of transition, with Eunice Abdelrazek, Salam Arama, Daniel Kurd, and Fadi Quran. So if people haven't seen that, I highly recommend it. But let's get to the subject at hand and start just with a little bit of ground rules. So as you can all see, and you're all very familiar with by now, there's a Q&A box. And ideally, people will use that to ask questions, not as a substitute chat function. And we'll be kind of going through those. I think there's a possibility to re-up questions, and so we'll see kind of what's capturing people's interest. And Jacob Plitman, who's off screen, is going to be sifting through those as well and feeding comments through. So we'll do it that way. And I thought really I would start with you, Josh. So in the article, and I think it might be interesting for people to hear kind of what was behind, what was the motivation in writing that piece. But you kind of set out for us a reality as you saw it, and in the multiple interviews that you conducted, whereby here was a left progressive project which should have seen this coming and mishandled it. And at the same time, a reality in which there was a very concerted effort to go after this project almost however it had responded. And you kind of managed to sustain those two thoughts throughout the piece. And so I kind of just wondered, now you've written the piece, you've reflected on, I'm sure, at least to some extent, on some of the feedback you've got. How do you feel about the piece as it begins to mature and take root in the discourse? And also maybe just touch on, and I'm sure we'll go deeper into this, something that you mention and you don't do a deep dive on, which is, are there ways in which we should be thinking about the carryover to the US and a kind of progressive project there?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll say just a little bit about the piece was long in incubation. And so it came out in November, but I began reporting on it in May when Corbyn stepped down and Starmer was elected leader of the party. But really the piece was germinating even before that, because I had been at another magazine, Dissent magazine, the previous year, and we had a lot of internal discussions about what was happening in Britain, and also what also seemed to be happening in the States. And this was in 2019 when Ilhan Omar was being attacked relentlessly for comments about Israel-Palestine. And it seemed that there was this problem that the left was having from a strategic perspective, mainly, was how I initially set out to approach it, which was we need to find a way to parry bad faith attacks on people who criticize the Israeli government and who speak out on Israel-Palestine, and avoid unforced errors where an intervention might not have been the smartest thing to have said. Not that there was anything like morally wrong with it, but it was a sloppy way of talking about the conflict. And that was sort of in the back of my mind as I began reporting on the piece. I think now that it has been out in the world and people have been reading it and commenting on it, I think what was taken away from it was that I had criticisms of Corbyn's approach to handling the attacks on him. And I think that is true, but also, I mean, maybe I didn't foreground this because it seemed to me, especially in writing for a left-wing audience, somewhat self-evident that any left-wing politician, and certainly a left-wing politician who's leading the largest social democratic party in Europe, is going to come under attack of just a kind of an inconceivable nature for speaking out on Israel-Palestine. But the thing is, that has to be the starting point for left politics. And I feel even more convinced of that now than I did actually going in, that we know that left politicians are going to be attacked in this way. And the real challenge is to figure out how to navigate that. I have been saying earlier to use this, I don't like using sports metaphors, but I do think this one is apt, that the left is convinced, and rightly, that the game is rigged. And yet the left strategy at the same time only seems to be to appeal to the refs of the game to say that it's rigged. And you end up in this sort of vicious, I mean, it's not really a vicious cycle, but this very poisonous dynamic where people on the left are constantly saying, look at all of the vast campaign that was dedicated to attacking Corbyn, or in the States to left-wing politicians. Look at all of the resources that Israel advocacy groups have marshaled against left-wing politicians. Look at the silencing of Palestinians. And that's all true. But at the same time, like, making a claim about about the left's own marginalization in those instances isn't a very effective way, or has not proven to be a very effective way of actually overcoming these attacks. And I still think that my closing sense after the piece went live and talking to people has really been, well, we just need to think a little bit more about this. Like, we need to have more conversations about it. We need to strategize more. There has to be more considered thinking not that we have to all retreat to the cave and sort of meditate in a monkish way, but I think we have to think more and harder and better, and not fall into reflexive traps, really, of sort of recrimination or attacking each other, which is what the left does when we lose. I mean, I think that's the worst thing to do right now would be to, and unfortunately it's already happening. And I also want to say that, like, what is happening right now in the Labour Party with the purges of prominent socialists and of people who've spoken out on Israel-Palestine is horrible. And clearly what Starmer is doing is not good for the left, and it's something that we should all oppose. But with that in the background, as hard as it is to do this, I think we really have to burrow and deep and think about how the left avoids something like this from happening again.
And Josh, I should have acknowledged that you're an assistant editor over there at Jewish Currents, and your background, and you worked at Dissent, which I think you mentioned, in 972. And rather than repeat that same mistake, I'll properly acknowledge you as I turn over to you, Rachel. So Rachel Shabi is a journalist. I often catch you on TV reviewing the day's papers, or the next day's papers on Sky. You write at The Guardian. You're also an author, book on Jews from Israel's Jews from Arab lands, and you've also, unsurprisingly, written on this subject most recently in a piece in The Nation, and really flowing from what Josh just said. You kind of said, look, this is how politics works. No one should have been surprised, but the example that Josh just gave of Ilhan Omar is actually one that you mentioned in your piece, and you wrote that both in the US, that what happened with Ilhan Omar, and in the UK with a Labour MP who perhaps be less known to folks watching in the States, MP Naz Shah, and you wrote that they demonstrated it's possible to drop the offensive terminology and criticisms of Israeli aggressions without diluting or altering their principles. And you also wrote that the spiraling out of control of this crisis in Labour was entirely avoidable. So I wonder if you could just unpack those things, the avoidability of it, the contrasting of the handling that you mentioned in your piece, Ilhan Naz, with how this played out under Corbyn's leadership, and maybe just look ahead a little for us in terms of how you think this now plays out going forward, the debate about anti-Semitism in Labour, and especially how this has played out on the front of Israel. And if you can do all that in the next couple of hours, we'll all be happy when we go off and celebrate Christmas. Thank you, Rachel.
Yes, I think it was entirely avoidable. But by the way, I think this panel is terrific, and thanks to Jewish Currents for putting it together and for inviting me to take part in it. It's great to be in conversation with all of you. I think it was avoidable because, as Josh says, it was going to be the case that someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who, you know, I should say I supported from the start. I welcomed and supported his leadership of the Labour Party from the beginning. It was inevitable that someone like him would come under sustained attack. I don't think necessarily just because of his position on Israel-Palestine, though that was an important factor, but just because he is so much from the left. You know, British politics has had very defined parameters of acceptable political debate. The Labour Party has not for some time strayed beyond sort of consensus politics. That is very centrist, that is very supportive of the status quo, of a, you know, neoliberal market-driven policies with, you know, tinkering around the edges to make it a little less painful for those worst affected. So when someone like Jeremy Corbyn comes along and says, no, this entire system is fueling, you know, the worst inequality in Europe, and we need to completely reconfigure the economy so that it functions better for everyone, of course, that's going to come under sustained attack from British politics that has skewed right for so long, and British media that has skewed right for so long. And so for me, the dynamic that was most troublesome was that, coupled with the sort of interminable factionalism of the Labour Party, most of which at a parliamentary level simply could not accept that Jeremy Corbyn was its leader. He was, you know, seen as some kind of interloper that had taken over the party by mistake, and therefore normal order should be resumed as quickly as possible with someone else not from the left of the party taking control of it. So that sort of factionalism, I think over the sort of 5 years of this crisis, I think is what has made this crisis over anti-Semitism, or the problem of it, so intractable. That has been a big factor of it, which is that everybody is responding to it, including the left, through the lens of this factionalism. So people are saying something because they're from the Labour right, or people are saying something because they're from the Labour left, and you know, you have to pick a side, and you know, stand in the middle, you get run over. So it's that kind of landscape. But the thing about that is that, yes, you know it's going to come. And I remember conversations early on with, you know, the Labour leadership and people in the office of the Labour leadership, where, you know, it was quite clear that that was known, that it was going to happen. And the reason I say it was avoidable is because right from the start, plenty of people in the Jewish left were engaged in conversations with the Corbyn leadership, time and again, saying, listen, this thing is likely to blow up. Let's nip it in the bud before it even happens. And here are some suggestions on how you do that. Time and again, people who should have been trusted by the Labour leadership were simply ignored. And that's where I think it diverges quite significantly from the way someone like Ilhan Omar handled it in the US. Now, of course, the dynamics of Jewish groups within the US and the UK are very different, not least because the UK Jewish population is tiny, but there are more organized progressive Jewish left groups in the US. But she was able to therefore consult with them and come up with an approach that was like, I'm not going to drop any of my principled objections to Israel's policies, but if the language is a bit difficult or problematic sometimes, then yes, I will adapt it and I will change it or drop it in consultation with progressive Jews. Is that going to stop her getting attacked? No, of course not. As we saw, she carries on getting attacked for various reasons, including attempts to accuse her of anti-Semitism. But what it does do is that it builds an alliance, it builds support, and it builds a base where, you know, you have solidarity over these issues and over these values. And having that solidarity over those issues and values is what is going to sustain you as the left and your ability to withstand those attacks, which I think we can all agree are inevitable. So that's the difference that I see and the failing that I see with the Corbyn leadership. And I say that as a supporter.
And in your latest piece, you call this the gift that keeps giving, and it's kind of, you look at it, you go, make it go away. It's a bit like being an Arsenal fan at the moment. Just what others, will it go away? I mean, how does one, from the perspective of today, how does one, in your opinion, begin to really turn a corner so this isn't the gift that keeps giving?
Yeah, I'm really not sure anymore. I think it has become quite intractable. Joshua was referring earlier to the current Labour leadership, Keir Starmer's response, which seems to me just as idiotic, but in a different direction, right? So, you know, if you have a leadership that takes a zero tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, where, you know, you root out the anti-Semites, that's the concept. I don't think that's going to work either, because what we're looking at here is a culture of anti-Semitism, as opposed to you know, people who are diehard, offensive, certifiable anti-Semites, of which, you know, they do exist, but having a zero tolerance approach that just goes for individuals and doesn't really explain what's going on. So these kind of what look like arbitrary suspensions that then look suspiciously like an assault on the left, that doesn't really do anything to promote a sort of understanding and awareness. And I think that's what's been lacking in the Labour left, not just since Corbyn, but dating back beyond that as well. And that's the bit that I think would be much more productive to focus on.
So, and I'm sure we're going to come back and discuss some of those further. And you kind of spoke to something which I think came out very strongly in Josh's piece, which is the frustration of people very positively predisposed from within the Jewish left to the Corbyn project as a progressive project, the frustration as this went along. And I think that it was palpable in what you were saying. And I think it was palpable in the conversations that you shared with us, Josh. I want to bring you into the conversation, Emily M. And you've written about the subject, you've written about the factionalism that Rachel just talked about. You wear a number of professional and activist hats. The ones that will bring into focus for the purposes of this conversation is that you're a co-founder of NAMOD, which is British Jews Against the Occupation. And if I'm going to kind of loosely use terms that folks in the US who don't know NAMOD will be familiar with, it's a kind of, if not nowish, and you're also the co-founder of a short-lived thing called Jews Against Boris, which was an attempt to try and offer a different Jewish progressive perspective in the context of the election campaign. And I wonder if I could ask you in your kind of opening comments that you share with us to pick up on something that Rachel just referred to, which is the dynamics of Jewish groups and the differences and some similarities between the US and UK, and help people who maybe are less exposed to that to understand that landscape, that the environment in which we were operating here, especially given this is something you really have experience in kind of organizing as the Jewish progressive in the UK and in that Corbyn moment, and what are the dynamics about the community here that it would be important for you to share with people? Yeah, and you just landed in Australia.
Yeah, currently in hotel quarantine in Australia. But yeah, it's been a really interesting time, I think, particularly to sort of build progressive political projects, Jewish projects in the UK. And I definitely think when we were thinking about Na'amod and when we were thinking about Jews Against Boris, we were definitely taking a lot of inspiration from what we saw from like an organized Jewish left in the States, and sort of seeing the impact that was having around talking about Israel-Palestine, but also in terms of sort of domestic progressive political politics. And so that was all happening at the same time as we did have this change in leadership. But I think the thing to be mindful of the UK context is also obviously like the fact that the Jewish community is a lot smaller. It has, we have had these sort of establishment representative bodies, which have now been given a much more elevated, I would argue, status within sort of the British public discourse and political discourse and system. But also, I think being in the context of Europe and being in the context where I think that there is like a different understanding of, I guess, Jewish trauma and I think particularly post-World War II trauma, and a lot of these like fears around growing sense of anti-Semitism, and particularly because also Britain as a country is also, I would argue, generally quite an institutionally racist place. And I think that anti-Semitism is also part of that, both but like predominantly across society, I think particularly on the right, but you do have some concerns around the left as well. And I think that there was this almost perfect storm of having this politically progressive a leader who also had done some things in his past that had made a lot of members of people in the Jewish communities uncomfortable, but also that there was not a progressive Jewish project really to foil those concerns and sort of look at a broader, bigger picture, I guess, or how do we, or like challenging to this understanding of anti-Semitism. So thinking about anti-Semitism as a structural issue, and that, the way that we address that is addressing other, or like building relationships with other groups who are marginalized and experiencing prejudice. Instead, it became about these really key individuals. So whether it would be, Jeremy Corbyn was like the fundamental problem, and if you got rid of Jeremy Corbyn, then you get rid of anti-Semitism. And so I think that became a real focus, and I think there was a growing unease in the community as the election went forward. And I would also say there were definitely people who were exploiting that. So whether it was people on the right of our community in these sort of establishment groups, whether it be the Board of Deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council, but also in terms of, the conservative government, like the fact that multiple conservative politicians got up on the day after the election and thanked the Jewish community for the fact that they won the election is really, really worrying, and also really speaks to this sense of like, the fact that anti-Semitism was this problem on the left, and the fact that the left couldn't get a handle on it meant that, the right will continue to capitalize on it for their political gain. It isn't clear right now which political party in Britain is on the side of the marginalized because of this issue around Labour anti-Semitism. And obviously, as I think Josh and Rachel have said, that was always going to be the case. And like, progressive politicians are often challenged and addressed. But like the fact that the left has not been able to get a grip on it is also something that we need to reflect on and take stock. And I think in terms of what it's also shown, though, and what the sort of hope I have, is that from doing Jews Against Boris and building Na'amod, I think there is actually also a lot of like young, not even young, just Jewish progressives who are also feeling pretty politically homeless right now. And perhaps the new strategy must to sort of be to move away from the Labour Party as this sole site of struggle, and actually look at other ways in which we could be trying to push these issues. I think something that I'm particularly concerned about as an anti-occupation campaigner is obviously the way in which the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has now become the sort of baseline for showing either your solidarity with the community or understanding how anti-Semitism operates, particularly given the fact that it is a deeply problematic definition that is undermining Palestinian solidarity and activism, and is very, very worrying. And I think that, you know, that to me is a real failure of, I think, a politically progressive Jewish project to not try and address that more effectively. But also, I think it's something that we now urgently must try and address. But I think it ultimately comes down to, we now also have a community that feels very, I think, partly vindicated by the fact that Labour lost the election so badly, and justified, but also one that, through the pain and difficulty of the last few years, has also, there's been this sort of sense that anti-Semitism is this unique form of oppression and bigotry that deserves special attention. And that is something that I think, like, that has been proliferated mostly by, to be honest, the media and I think the political class. But it has resulted, I think, in us being like further marginalized and divided from other groups who are experiencing these kinds of other kinds of oppressions, not to mention Jews in our community who have experienced multiple forms of oppression. You know, there was a lot of Black Jewish comrades who spoke out after the election saying they felt really abandoned by the establishment of the community, who kept going on about Labour anti-Semitism and not talking about the anti-Black racism in the Conservative Party. So, you know, this tactic of divide and rule is something that has been used throughout history. It is now being used very effectively, both in sort of the public political discourse, but also in the discourse in our own community. So I think that in terms of trying to be building grassroots work, I think the most effective way for us to moving forward is to be trying to move away from this Labour discourse and this idea of the only way to be politically engaged is through party politics, and sort of take, I think, some lessons that we've seen from the States and like looking at other sides of struggle and other ways to galvanize our community. You know, when we build actions, when we do actions around supporting cleaners going on strike in care homes for fair wages, that has like significant turnout in terms of people wanting to come and support those the workers who are striking. So there's lots of different things that we can be doing. But I do feel that the community is very fractured and very fragile, and the left have lost. And I think that there is something that is really important here to be thinking about, like, why are we losing and why aren't we speaking to people, and what more can we be doing to really try and shift into a new era for, I think, like a politically progressive Jewish project.
So thanks for those thoughts, and there's things coming through obviously on the Q&A, and let me perhaps start with one of those. I want to pick up on several things you raised, Em, but perhaps I'll start and turn to you, Josh, on this one. And as people can see from the nature of the session, because I think a couple of people have said, can we get some JVL voices, which is, you know, this isn't a format where people can kind of join us by voice, and so that's not possible. But I think there was a point made that those voices weren't reflected in your piece, Josh, and I wonder whether you want to. So we're talking about Jewish Voices for Labour, and it's a group active within the Labour Party that clearly took a position on this. And so, do you want to speak to that, Josh?
Sure. I mean, I did speak to members of Jewish Voice for Labor for the article, and I quoted Mike Cushman in the piece, and in an earlier draft there was a longer quote from him, and I thought we had a very informative conversation, and it's useful, and I think that as far as creating in some sense a space for public left-wing Jewishness, I mean, JVL has played a role, and an important one. I think what came out recently in some of sort of a public debate over the article that JVL published by Donna Neville, which I thought was a good response, and I responded to it on Twitter. I think that I don't think
it, is that you? Sorry, I thought it was me who had frozen because I was having, could people hear me? Nod, Rachel and Em. Okay, so we lost Josh. I assumed it was the problem on my side. But we began, Josh began to address that, and I just wonder if there's anything, there was a question specifically addressed to yourself, Rachel, in terms of the thing that I then echoed about people who wanted this to succeed as a project, were offering advice that they thought could be helpful and weren't listened to. And how did that play out with JVL? So if you want to come in on that, Rachel, or if you want to come in on that, Em, and we've got Josh back, but I'll finish with seeing if you want to come in on those issues before going back to Josh, and hopefully you can finish off your thought, which we only caught a little bit of.
Sure. I mean, I can't speak to, I'll let Josh finish that thought about JVL. So I can't really speak to that, but what I can say is that the thing about the Jewish left and listening to Jewish left voices is that what often happened with the Corbyn left is that, there's this tendency just to listen to the Jewish left that you already agree with. So if there's a Jewish left group that is set up for the purpose of saying, actually, this is all a smear and a witch hunt, then, and that kind of confirms your view of it, because in any case, Corbyn has been relentlessly attacked since he became leader, and therefore you think the anti-Semitism charge is just one more iteration of that. That's the good faith interpretation of why you would think that. But then you have a Jewish voice that you agree with. And there's been far too much of a tendency, I think, within elements of the Jewish left, of the Corbyn left, sorry, to just find people that already confirm their worldview on anti-Semitism. It was overstated, it was just used to destroy Corbyn, etc. Whereas, the reality is that the British Jewish community is small, but the majority would not be represented by that view. And so you have a problem there. You have a problem of engagement. And I'm not sure that the Corbyn left ever really dealt with that, of, okay, but what do we do, given that the Jewish people that conform to our precise worldview, or at least the ones that we consider do, because they agree with us on anti-Semitism, are just a tiny minority of the Jewish population. What do we do about that? And I didn't really see any engagement with that question, I have to say.
And Em, did you want to add or?
Yeah, I think something that what I noticed a lot during the election, particularly on the discourse, was from the right, actually, was don't sacrifice Jews in the name of social justice. It was like a lot of the discourse that was coming out, I think both in terms of some of the groups in our community, but also in the Jewish communities, but also in the sort of more public political discourse. And I think the sort of backfiring of that is that there are some elements of the Corbyn left who, because of that discourse and the fact that it was arguably successful, now see any kind of attempt to try and address like concerns around anti-Semitism in Labour on the left as basically it forces everyone back into their bunkers. And I think that this is just a smear, this is just undermining a political project. And Jews have essentially been used as a weapon to do that. And that is like a bit of real tragedy. And I think that as a result of that, that focus on Corbyn becomes the sort of the lightning rod in which to sort of rally around. So instead of having to try and address these more like substantive cultural, structural issues around how we focus, how we address these problems, how we think about strategy, how we go forward, it just becomes a conversation about like, is Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite or is he not? Is he a good guy or is he not? And it just that conversation keeps us stuck. And I have wondered over the last few months, like, are there political actors or people within these spheres who are like, who really want us to stay in this conversation of like, is this about Jeremy or is it not? You know, is Jeremy a good person or a bad person? Sorry. And I think that is something that if you care about like building political progressive, like a winning political progressive strategy, we need to move on from that. And that's going to take time. But coming back to Jeremy Corbyn over and over and over again is, frankly, I think a bit pointless at this point.
I mean, just to maybe add to that, my sense living through all of this was that, of course, as everyone has said, this was going to be gone after relentlessly by a coalition of the internal opposition in Labour, the broader opposition on the Tory side, in the media, in the country, the interests that kind of a project would have taken on. And that would have included a significant cohort on the Jewish side. But that there were fissures and tensions within the Jewish community, including over something which I hope we'll talk about next, which is, where is anti-Semitism and where is a necessary and legitimate conversation around Israel and its policies? That there were fissures that could have been teased out more, and that the way in which it was responded to and sticking to the narrative of that cohort of people that Rachel referred to earlier meant that one got absolutely nowhere in teasing out those possible fissures. And a community that is normally really quite divided. I mean, I think it's a real achievement to get the kind of consensus, even in the establishment, to get the liberal and reform rabbinical cohort as aligned with the more traditionally conservative right of center establishment as they were in that moment. And I think that was down in some significant measure to the mistaken steps taken on the leadership side. Josh, did you want to add anything to this beyond a frozen picture of your face?
Sure. I mean, I think what I was in the process of saying was roughly, I mean, it goes back to what I had said before about the sense of knowing that you're going to be attacked from this as being the starting point for left politics, not the beginning, not the end point of it. And I think this came clear, and it's come clear in my conversations with people on the left in the UK and over the course of the reporting, which is that, well, the Board of Deputies is full of conservatives, or the British Jewish community is predominantly affluent and, it's bourgeois. And like, those things might be true, but arguing that is true in public is probably not going to like help the cause or to shrug off the accusations that Jeremy and the rest of the party were facing. And so I think at a certain point we have to be able, or the left has to be able to distinguish between sort of like a moral argument that might be true, like empirically, and also just recognizing the limits strategically of what's possible. And I think this is an example of we're like segueing into the part of the conversation that's about the IHRA more properly. And yeah, I mean, I think that the IHRA is a tremendously damaging definition, and unfortunately, part of the great victory, not just that the conservatives have scored, but also that the Israel advocacy world has scored in the wake of the Corbyn episode, is that the IHRA has become an entrenched part of how anti-Semitism is defined. And this also didn't come out of nowhere. Like, we knew this was happening. This was moving through the world in 2018 and 2019. We knew that there was going to have to be some way to make a case about distinguishing between sort of what a trenchant criticism of Israel is, even Israel as it exists right now, or actually existing, and of what, or a trenchant criticism of what actually existing Zionism is, what that is on the one hand, and what anti-Semitism is. And those are sensitive conversations, but it seemed as though so little of the groundwork was laid in order to have those conversations properly, that by the time in 2018 that this that sort of Corbyn was faced with the ultimatum of having to ratify the IHRA, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that it had already been lost, and I think it's really regrettable, and it's depressing and sad. But I think it only highlights why we need to come up with a better way to highlight just how damaging the IHRA is, and that it was. I mean, there's a great piece up at Vashti, which is a fantastic new British left-wing Jewish website that really gets into the details of how this definition was crafted intentionally to quash Palestine solidarity activism. That might not be what some of its prominent authors have, but if you look on the record of what people who have been affiliated with the definition have said, like, it's clearly what their intent was. And I think it is possible to talk about that without slipping into denialism of where there is actually anti-Semitism. And you might say, like, it's actually imperative to be able to do that if we're going to actually prevent the IHRA from being further legislated. I mean, this is something that we're preoccupied at Jewish Currents with right now, and we're charting quite, like, literally how US Jewish groups are trying to push the IHRA into legislation. I mean, the Jewish Federations, which is one of the biggest Jewish organizations in the United States, has decided that they want the Biden administration to put this into law. It already is used by the State Department. The Trump administration included in an executive order with the Education Department to adjudicate anti-discrimination claims, so that if you say Israel is a racist state, you're now committing an act of anti-Jewish bigotry against a Jewish student. The irony of all these cases that are litigated is sometimes the people making the trenchant critique of Israel are themselves Jewish. It's like a mind-boggling, like, auto anti-Semitism that's happened. But again, this all points to the imperative figuring out a really effective way of stopping this from happening. Because sorry, I was just going to say, the ultimate victims of this are Palestinians, and it's the Palestinian cause, who end up not being able to advocate for themselves at all in the West.
So let's stick with this theme, because and there are some other questions, and I don't want to do those an injustice, even if we can't get to everything. But there's a lot in that Q&A from people with us about the anti-Semitism, Israel nexus, and specifically about the IHRA. And so in the conversation that we've had about the UK, there's been this question of a culture of anti-Semitism and zero tolerance. And partly, of course, that goes into the Israel question. And that, there's a conversation here basically between policing and legislating versus educating. And to me, it's pretty clear that whatever else is going on in terms of the real threat of anti-Semitism, a real culture of anti-Semitism on the left that does need to be addressed, of course, the resurgence of a particularly virulent strain and violent strain when it comes to the US and incidents like Pittsburgh Synagogue of murderous anti-Semitism on the white nationalist right. But I think what particularly characterizes this moment, and you've started to take us there, Josh, is a strategic decision on the part of Israel and on the part of an Israeli leadership that knew exactly where it was going in terms of there not being anything resembling the realization of Palestinian rights anytime in the foreseeable. The way to fight this was not on the grounds of policy towards the Palestinians, but on the grounds of what you are doing something that crosses a line and constitutes anti-Semitism, when we know that an Israeli governmental ministry, the Strategic Affairs Ministry, has put money and resources and the not insignificant capabilities that agencies within the Israeli system bring to bear into this. So, it goes beyond undermining Palestinian solidarity activists. It is criminalizing Palestinian political speech. And something that has been so depressing for me to witness in the UK is that the ability to talk openly, honestly about what's going on has been the collateral damage of the way the Corbyn project played out. And there are some questions on this, and many people have asked. So Ron from Bristol has asked about this issue. Colin Watson about the adoption of the IHRA in Labour. So we've now seen universities being told that if they don't adopt IHRA, their capacity to confer degrees, their funding will be withdrawn, etc. And I wanted to get a take from Em and Rachel in terms of the UK, how you think one can reverse some of this. Is some of it reversible? Can we get back more onto a path where anti-Semitism is not defined, is not regulated, legislated, policed in those ways, or is this something that we're stuck with?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, and something that definitely keeps me up at night in terms of where we move forward from here. I think a few things. I think first I really want to echo what you said. I think one of the big failures of the Corbyn project to get a grip on the issues around anti-Semitism has allowed for this definition to become the baseline for how we talk about anti-Semitism. I think that is a fundamental detrimental impact of what has happened, and I think something that is really, really concerning. I think in terms of moving forward, I also think the other broader problem is that because of the sort of mess around Labour, is you also have more broadly politically progressive Jews who are generally maybe anti-occupation, don't agree with what maybe two-state solution, broadly don't agree with what the Israeli government is doing on occupation, and it might even go as far to question Zionism more generally, who still think the IHRA is an important definition, because because of the way that Labour has this discourse has erupted around anti-Semitism in the UK, and thinks it's actually really important to have some kind of written diktat around how we talk about it. So I think that's a big issue that we now, as working on this in this space in the UK, have to try and grapple with how we really shift thinking around the IHRA. Particularly when people who've been seen as who are on the left, who are supportive of the Jewish community, allegedly support this definition as well. So it's a very complicated internal conversation as well as a broader one. But I think in terms of addressing it, I think the first thing that if we're doing organized Jewish left work is to work and support Palestinian activists and organizers who are going to be working on this issue. I think that's really fundamentally important, and having I think there is a strategic value in dissenting Jewish voices around this issue, but coming at it from a perspective that is not solely focusing on Labour. I think this is about building a sense of solidarity between Palestinian and Jewish groups in the UK to address this dual challenge, and really getting behind efforts to try and educate our own community, but also educate the wider public around it. And I think that that's very important, whether that's through public action, through education, through having those conversations with our communities. I think that's really fundamental, and building those relationships with other Palestinian groups, because I definitely think that in the UK, the Jewish community, obviously, because of some of their positions on Israel-Palestine, because of what I would say is a general pro-occupation position by our Jewish establishment, there is a very significant divide and rift between Palestinian groups and organizations in the UK and Jewish groups. And I think that the work starts there as well, in terms of building those relationships. And I think the other thing that we should be doing is really thinking about a better understanding of anti-Semitism. I think that the reason the IHRA can also take such a foothold is because we haven't had these murky and tricky and difficult conversations and discussions around how anti-Semitism operates in the UK, the history of anti-Semitism in the UK, but also in Europe, aside from the Holocaust. I think that there just isn't really a strong understanding, but also how anti-Semitism intersects with other forms of racism, with other issues within society, and really trying to build a better understanding. But I think that it is really crucial. Labour is a part of that, but it's not the only part of that. And I think really giving people a space where they can go, where they maybe don't have to talk about Labour for now, is really important. But I fundamentally think that every group in the UK who cares about freedom and equality and dignity for everyone in Israel-Palestine needs to actively come out against the IHRA. I think it's fundamental, and not doing that is a disservice to that work.
Thanks, Em. Rachel, can I bring you in on this?
Yeah. So I agree with a lot of what Em just said. And I think that, I mean, it's really frustrating because, you know, I can remember, you know, during the 2000s, including a period when I was reporting from Israel-Palestine, it was very much part of progressive left conversation that went, because this was when Israel and pro-right-wing Israel, pro-expansionist Israel groups were really going for this conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And I can remember like a big part of the progressive discourse being, listen, number one, that's wrong, like on its face, that's wrong. Number two, if you continue to do this, you're actually going to erode the concept of anti-Semitism, and you're gonna, to the extent that when people discuss anti-Semitism, no one will believe you and everyone will assume the worst. And lo and behold, you know, this exact thing, I mean, that is such a characteristic of the conversation we've been having with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party for the past few years. No one believes you. There's so much bad faith assumption. So it has been, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but one of the consequences of that has been to erode the conversation. And Labour, by the time it came to introduce the IHRA, it was such a mess. It already had so much bad faith between it and Jewish groups, including the Jewish labor movement inside Labour, which, you know, I think very early on was not, you know, they weren't interested in being critical of Corbyn. Quite a lot of the JLM members I spoke to said, we support him, you know, including his position on Israel-Palestine. But it was just the lack of responsiveness from the leadership, so that by the time we got to the IHRA definition, had it not been that situation, had it not been the Corbyn missteps and mismanagement, you know, I said at the time, there probably could have been enough rational people in the room, including Palestinian groups and Palestine representatives in that room, to be able to work on the definitions in the IHRA and change them, you know, especially those two that were so problematic. You could have done that with good faith, but there was none by that stage. But what I would add is that when it came to the EHRC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, that issued its report on Labour and anti-Semitism, just released the report. It didn't use the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It didn't need to. All it needed to do was to apply equality law. And I think that is very significant in and of itself, but it also shows us, I mean, this is the first time we've had UK equality law applied to the question of discrimination on racial grounds inside a political party. It's a very sort of clinical and dry analysis of that. But what that means is that if it's possible to do it for Labour anti-Semitism, then it is certainly possible to do it for other racisms. So the Labour Party, once it's done implementing it so that it fulfills its legal requirements to the Equality Commission for Anti-Semitism, absolutely should go ahead and implement the same thing for Labour Islamophobia, which is, you know, a problem as well. We've been hearing a lot about that lately, anti-Black racism inside the Labour Party. And then we can go to the Conservatives and their appalling record on Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. So to me, that is a really important point, that you actually do have a definition there with the equality law that brings anti-Semitism back into the fight against all racism more collectively. And I feel like what Emma's been saying earlier about this idea that it's become a separate thing, partly because British media and political conversation about racism is absolutely hopeless. It has focused on anti-Semitism at the expense of other racism, which it completely ignores, often for political expedience. So I do think that the Equality Commission's report does give us a way to reconnect a collective fight against racism.
It's such an important point, and thanks for making it, Rachel. On that the EHRC report didn't use the IHRA. The tools exist. There are tools that don't create divisions between Jews and other communities, and we need to kind of keep reminding people of that. We're going to close. I want to see if you want to come in again on this, Josh, because we've focused the conversation back on the UK, but of course, this is a potential fault line and gift that could keep giving for Republicans in the US and inside the Democrat Party, and the attempt to really breathe as much life into trying to divide and depict a wing of the party as also falling foul of these definitions, as engaging in anti-Semitism. And we've seen it turbocharged in the last weeks of the Trump presidency, with the Secretary of State threatening to designate major human rights organizations as being anti-Semitic, and basically coming out and saying not only BDS, but any form of anti-Zionism and even any differentiation between settlement products and the rest of Israel, which is what international law and UN Security Council resolutions say, that constitutes anti-Semitism. Just any closing thoughts you have on your hopes or your fears of how this might play out in the US and in the Democrat Party?
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer on a sort of nearer term is that I think because more than in the UK, the Jewish community is sort of wrapped within the umbrella of the Democratic Party, there is a little bit more leeway, and there is more of a relationship, and that Jews are quite loyal Democrats. Arguably, Jews are among the most loyal Democrats, and it would take a lot more, I think, to be able to turn the to allow the communal establishment to turn the community against the party. I actually think that in an instance, and you've seen this actually, there have been attempts at this already, to like a kind of exodus, Jews leaving the Democratic Party, engineered by pro-Israel groups, and it's not caught on. Like I think in some ways that's the good news. The good news is that Jewish attachment to the Democratic Party, I think, is strong enough to even withstand to some degree of discomfort with the way that like a more trenchant criticism of Israel. At the same time, I think people have to be careful. I think it is absolutely possible to be an anti-Zionist and not to be an anti-Semite. I think it's possible to harshly criticize Israeli policies and not be an anti-Semite. But I think that too often politicians don't spend enough time actually thinking about what it would mean to speak in such a way clearly, where the intervention in the realm of the politics of Israel-Palestine has a clear goal. We're making this criticism of this policy with an end towards X or Y. And so that it seems as though there is a reason for this, and that it doesn't feel arbitrary or disconnected to what's actually happening. In the long term, my big fear, I mean, the reason, Daniel, you touched on this, the reason why the IHRA's potency right now, or why it has potency and why that potency seems to be growing, is because it is a response to the one-state reality in Israel-Palestine. Because the one-state reality is undemocratic, the IHRA phrases any systemic criticism of the undemocratic one-state reality as anti-Semitism. And I think that even in parts of the left, including the non-Zionist left, I mean, one of the ironies to me of the whole Jeremy Corbyn story is that Jeremy actually was a supporter of the two-state, of at least on paper, of a two-state solution. So he, in some ways, could have said, yes, I support Israel's right to exist, which he seems, as a two-state solution supporter, did, and like could have, I don't know, sort of sidestepped some of this. But because so much of the left is still committed to a two-state solution, along the logic of kind of partition and separation, it's going to take the left a lot longer to come up with a constructive response to the one-state reality, and that I think is something that we'll probably be arguing about long into the future about what does it mean for the left in a post two-state reality. The right has its answer. The Jewish right knows it wants a single undemocratic reality in Israel-Palestine. But I think that, this is something that the Palestinian movement itself is still arguing about. That's why, the article that Daniel mentioned that's on the Jewish Currents website right now with several leading Palestinian intellectuals talking through this impasse themselves about what does it mean if the two nation states side by side paradigm is no longer relevant. Then we have to rethink things a little bit.
Thanks. And I'm going to wrap it up. I want to apologize to those who've made contributions in the Q&A box that didn't get addressed, and thank the panelists. I think to capture a little bit of what has come up now, I don't think it's a coincidence that as a leading Israeli human rights NGO, Yesh Din, has come out with a paper using the designation of apartheid as the legally correct designation to describe the situation, as we are expecting some major human rights organizations to come out globally with that designation, that there should be an attempt to discredit the groups. What I think is clear is in certain quarters, this isn't about opening a conversation on how to tackle anti-Semitism, how we educate people, how we engage. This is the opposite. This is about how to close down conversation, how to close down political space. Whether it's in the UK, the knock-on effects are not going to end just with Palestine. Legislation that is born of this whole issue will severely limit the ability of local councils to, for instance, conduct boycotts against, whether that's on the basis of human rights abuses, arms sales. In the US, it's not going to end with Palestine. It cuts across to other free speech issues. So I'm just left with the thought that M shared with us, which is, let's not just make this about the space to have this conversation in Labour. And I think if this becomes about, does Labour now become an inhospitable climate to Palestinian Brits and British Arab community and the Muslim community, as it has been depicted as being an inhospitable climate to the Jewish community? This is a much broader conversation, and it's a conversation where there are feedback loops. And so I think it was really interesting that Jewish Currents asked us to do this and pulled this together. And I think the feedback loops between what goes on in the UK and in the US and elsewhere are significant in this respect. And I will perhaps just draw out one thing that was offered in the Q&A box to close on. Tony Karen, who has just relaunched his Rootless Cosmopolitan blog, which I highly recommend, suggests a Harper's letter style piece. I would say lahavdil, in other words, yes, but very, very different, by prominent Jewish writers, thinkers, basically, coming out with the absurdity of the IHRA and challenging the policing of speech. Whether it's that or other ideas, I think there's a lot to be done, both to keep open a progressive space and to keep open the debate that needs to be had about what's happening in the Middle East, and as something that's absolutely necessary as we interact with our Palestinian colleagues. And if I'm allowed a third both, then what Rachel said, which is one of the effects of this is to erode the very concept of anti-Semitism as something that needs to be taken seriously. And I think that's also an important thought to leave people with. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thanks, Em, Rachel, and Josh.